November 12, 1944. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside Camp Boulder, Colorado, kicking up dust that settled on the shoulders of 32 German women who had just become prisoners of war. Charlotte Werner pressed her face against the metal slats, trying to catch a glimpse of this strange American landscape that would become her prison. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early winter snow, so different from the flat plains surrounding Berlin where she had grown up. She clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world: one change of clothes, a wooden comb, and a photograph of her family that she prayed was still alive somewhere in the ruins of Germany. The women climbed down from the truck in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms torn and stained from weeks of transit through France, then England, then across the Atlantic in the dark hold of a military transport ship. Charlotte noticed how the American soldiers watched them with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. These guards had clearly never processed female prisoners before. One young private kept glancing at them, then looking away quickly, as if unsure whether military protocol applied the same way to women as it did to the thousands of male German POWs held in camps across America. Captain Ruth Anderson emerged from the administrative building, her uniform crisp and her expression professionally neutral. She was a tall woman in her late 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had fought hard to earn her rank in a man's military. She surveyed the bedraggled group of German women with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Charlotte felt herself straightening unconsciously, some remnant of military discipline asserting itself even in defeat. The processing took 3 hours. Names recorded, photographs taken, belongings searched and catalogued. Charlotte answered questions in halting English, learned during her years at university before the war had interrupted everything. Where were you captured? What was your role? Do you have family in Germany? The questions felt intrusive, exposing the ruins of her former life to strangers who had every reason to hate her. She had been a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, translating intercepted Allied communications, believing she was serving her country's defense. Now she understood she had been part of something far darker than defense, though the full extent of Germany's crimes remained unclear to her. By the time the women were led to the mess hall for their first meal as prisoners, the November sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Charlotte painfully of home. The dining facility was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches, steam rising from industrial-sized pots in the kitchen beyond. The smell hit her first. Meat, actual meat, and something sweet she couldn't identify. Her stomach cramped with sudden hunger. She hadn't eaten anything but watery soup and stale bread for weeks. The 32 German women filed into the mess hall with the mechanical precision of soldiers, even though their war was over. Charlotte found herself near the front of the line, watching as American kitchen staff loaded metal trays with portions that seemed impossibly generous. A thick slice of meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans that actually looked fresh, and a piece of bread with real butter. She stared at the tray thrust into her hands, unable to reconcile this abundance with everything she had been told about America. The propaganda had promised them that Americans were starving, that their economy had collapsed, that their soldiers survived on scraps, while Germany's superior organization kept its people fed. Yet here was more food than she had seen on a single plate in over 2 years. Ilse Mayer stood behind Charlotte in line, her thin frame trembling slightly as she accepted her own tray. The young woman from Munich had barely spoken since their capture in France 3 weeks earlier, her light brown eyes constantly darting around as if expecting punishment at any moment. Sophie Zimmermann, older and more composed, took her tray with a curt nod to the American server, maintaining a dignity that Charlotte found both admirable and heartbreaking. They were defeated, captured, imprisoned, yet still trying to hold on to some sense of who they had been before the world collapsed around them. The German women clustered together at tables on the far side of the dining hall, as far from the American staff as possible. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against metal trays and the occasional whispered word in German. Charlotte forced herself to eat slowly, fighting the urge to devour everything on her plate like a starving animal. The meatloaf was seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize, the potatoes were creamy and rich, and the butter melted into the warm bread in a way that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. This was enemy food, prepared by enemy hands, and it was the best meal she had eaten since before the war began. Across the dining hall, Private Edward Thompson watched the German prisoners with undisguised fascination. He was a farm boy from Iowa, 20 years old, with sandy hair and freckles that made him look even younger. He had volunteered for kitchen duty specifically to avoid combat, a decision his father had called cowardly but which his mother had quietly supported. Now he found himself serving food to actual enemy soldiers, except they were women who looked exhausted and frightened, and not at all like the brutal Nazis he had seen in newsreels. One of them, a blonde woman with high cheekbones and intelligent gray eyes, caught him staring. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw something in her expression that surprised him. Not hatred or defiance, but shame. Sergeant Charles Mitchell stood near the door, arms crossed, observing the entire room with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot trouble before it started. He had served in North Africa and Sicily before being assigned stateside duty after taking shrapnel in his left leg, and he carried himself with the wary competence of a combat veteran. He noticed the rigid separation between the German women and American staff, the way both groups seemed uncertain about how to navigate this unprecedented situation. Male POW camps had established routines and protocols, but no one had written a manual for how American men should guard German women. The potential for problems, both disciplinary and moral, seemed endless. The first week at Camp Boulder passed in a fog of routine and careful distance. The German women rose at 6 each morning, performed assigned cleaning duties, attended English lessons that Captain Anderson had mandated, and spent their afternoons in the recreation yard under the watchful eyes of American guards. Charlotte found the structure both comforting and suffocating. It gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into despair, but it also emphasized their complete powerlessness. They were pieces being moved around a board by others, with no say in their own futures. The dining hall remained a space of silent tension. The German women ate together, spoke only to each other, and avoided eye contact with their captors. The American staff served food with professional efficiency, but little warmth. It was a cold peace, fragile and uncomfortable, with both sides uncertain about how much humanity they were permitted to show across enemy lines. Charlotte noticed that Private Thompson still watched them sometimes, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile, but he never spoke beyond the necessary "next" when serving the meal line. Everything changed on the 8th day because of a cough. Johanna Kraus, the youngest of their group at 21, had developed a persistent hack that echoed through the barracks at night. She tried to muffle it in her thin blanket, embarrassed by the attention it drew, but the Colorado altitude and cold November air were making it worse. Dr. Francis Morgan had examined her and prescribed rest, but the cough lingered, keeping Johanna and several others awake through the long mountain nights. Private Thompson had noticed his grandmother back in Iowa had raised 7 children through prairie winters, and she had taught him her remedies for everything from fever to frostbite. On the 9th morning, as Johanna moved through the breakfast line with dark circles under her eyes and that persistent cough rattling in her chest, Thompson did something that surprised even himself. He stepped away from his serving station and returned a moment later with a chipped ceramic mug filled with steaming liquid. He held it out to her, and without a word, just a simple gesture across the divide. Johanna stared at the mug as if it might be poisoned. Charlotte, standing beside her, could smell honey and something herbal, like the chamomile her own mother used to brew. The other German women had frozen, watching this unexpected interaction with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Sergeant Mitchell's hand had moved instinctively toward his belt, ready to intervene if this violated some regulation he couldn't quite name. But Captain Anderson, observing from across the room, gave a slight shake of her head. Let it play out. Thompson kept his hand extended, the mug still steaming between them. It's just tea, he said quietly in his Iowa drawl. Honey and herbs. My grandmother's recipe. It'll help with the cough. His German was non-existent and he had no idea if Johanna understood English, but his tone carried intention that transcended language. This wasn't a trap or a trick. It was simply one human being trying to ease another's suffering. Johanna looked to Charlotte, then to Sophie, seeking permission or guidance. Charlotte found herself nodding slowly, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps because kindness, even from an enemy, deserved acknowledgement. Perhaps because the gesture was so ordinary, so domestic, that it momentarily made them feel less like prisoners and more like people. Johanna accepted the mug with trembling hands, whispered "Danke" so quietly it was barely audible, and took a careful sip. The honey sweetness spread across her tongue, followed by the soothing warmth of herbs she couldn't name. Her eyes widened slightly with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. Thanksgiving arrived with unexpected fanfare at Camp Boulder. Charlotte had never heard of this American holiday before, but the excitement among the staff was unmistakable. Private Thompson and the other kitchen workers had been preparing for days, and tantalizing smells had been drifting from the mess hall since dawn. The German women whispered among themselves, trying to understand what this celebration meant. Was it a military victory they were being forced to witness? A reminder of American superiority? Sophie, who had studied some American history before the war, explained in hushed German that it was a harvest festival, a day of gratitude and family gathering. Captain Anderson had wrestled with how to handle the holiday. Her superiors had offered no guidance about whether enemy prisoners should participate in American celebrations. Some officers at other camps had deliberately excluded German POWs from special meals, using the contrast as a subtle form of psychological pressure. But Anderson had seen something shifting in her small camp over the past 2 weeks. The women were compliant, respectful, and increasingly curious about their captors. Thompson's simple act of kindness with the tea had cracked something open, and she sensed an opportunity that might be lost if she chose cruelty over compassion. The decision was made that the German prisoners would receive the same Thanksgiving meal as the American staff. When the women entered the mess hall that Thursday afternoon, they stopped in collective astonishment. The tables had been arranged differently, with white cloths covering their surfaces and small arrangements of autumn leaves serving as decorations. The usual institutional atmosphere had been transformed into something approaching festivity, and the food. Charlotte felt her breath catch as she moved through the serving line and saw what was being offered. Roasted turkey, golden brown and glistening, mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, stuffing fragrant with sage and onions, cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels, green beans almondine, fresh rolls still warm from the oven, and at the end of the line, something that made several of the German women stop and stare with open confusion. Pies. 3 different kinds arranged on a side table, their crusts a beautiful golden brown, steam still rising from the latticed tops of what Thompson proudly identified as apple, cherry, and pumpkin. Charlotte accepted her overflowing plate with hands that shook slightly. She had never seen this much food prepared with such obvious care, not even before the war, when her family had been comfortable. This wasn't survival rations or military efficiency. This was abundance celebrated, shared without apparent resentment toward those who had so recently been enemies. She carried her tray to a table where Ilse and Sophie were already seated, both women staring at their plates with expressions mixing hunger, confusion, and something that might have been shame. The meal began in the usual silence, but it was a different quality of quiet now. The German women ate slowly, savoring flavors that many of them had never experienced before. The turkey was moist and tender, so unlike the stringy game birds that had occasionally appeared in Germany during the later war years. The stuffing was rich with butter and herbs. The cranberry sauce provided a sweet tart contrast that startled and delighted in equal measure. Charlotte found herself closing her eyes as she chewed, overcome by tastes that felt almost sinful in their richness. Private Thompson moved between tables, refilling water glasses and checking if anyone needed anything. When he reached the German women's section, he paused beside Charlotte's table. "You should save room," he said, gesturing toward the pies waiting on the side table. "The best part comes after. My grandmother always said a meal without dessert is like a day without sunshine." He smiled, a genuine expression free of mockery or superiority, then moved on before Charlotte could formulate a response in her careful English. The moment arrived with less ceremony than it deserved. Private Thompson emerged from the kitchen carrying a large metal container that Charlotte would later learn was called an ice cream maker. Frost clung to its sides, and when he lifted the lid, white vapor rolled out like smoke from a magical cauldron. The German women watched with puzzled interest as he began scooping something pale and creamy onto plates beside thick wedges of apple pie. The combination seemed strange, even wasteful. Why would anyone put something cold on top of something warm? Captain Anderson had positioned herself where she could observe the prisoners' reactions. She had grown up in Vermont, where apple pie à la mode was as fundamental to life as maple syrup and fall foliage, and she found herself unexpectedly curious about how these women from another world would respond to this most American of traditions. There was something deeply symbolic about the moment, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the innocence of it, the simple pleasure of dessert offered to people who had known so little pleasure in recent years. Charlotte accepted her plate with the pie and its mysterious cold topping. Up close, she could see that the white substance had a creamy texture similar to whipped cream, but firmer, more solid. Tiny crystals sparkled on its surface, where it was already beginning to melt against the warm pie. The apple filling beneath bubbled slightly, releasing the scent of cinnamon and brown sugar. She picked up her fork, acutely aware that Ilse and Sophie were watching her, waiting to see if this strange American custom was safe or perhaps some kind of test. The first bite changed everything. The buttery, flaky crust dissolved on her tongue, followed by the sweet tart burst of spiced apples, and then the cold, impossibly smooth cream that tasted like frozen sweetness itself. The temperature contrast was shocking, the warm pie meeting the cold cream in a way that made both taste more intense. Charlotte's eyes widened involuntarily. She had never experienced anything like this. Ice cream was not something that had existed in her world. Even before the war, frozen desserts had been rare luxuries in Germany, found only in the finest restaurants of Berlin, and during the war, such frivolities had disappeared entirely. She took another bite, then another, unable to stop herself. The ice cream melted into the pie filling, creating rivers of vanilla cream that mixed with the cinnamon apples. It was decadent, almost obscenely rich, and utterly wonderful. Around her, the other German women were having similar revelations. Ilse made a small sound of surprise and delight. Johanna, whose cough had improved with Thompson's tea, actually smiled for the first time since their capture. Even Sophie, who maintained the strictest discipline among them, allowed her expression to soften as she savored the unexpected pleasure. Private Thompson watched from his position by the serving table, a satisfied grin spreading across his freckled face. He had seen this reaction before, back home when his grandmother would surprise neighbor children with her homemade ice cream. There was something universal about that moment of discovery, that first encounter with a perfect dessert. It transcended nationality, politics, and even war. For just a moment, these weren't enemy prisoners and American captors. They were simply people sharing in the joy of something delicious. Charlotte finished her pie slowly, scraping her fork across the plate to capture every last trace of melted ice cream. When she finally set down her utensils, she felt something shift inside her chest. It was a small feeling, barely noticeable, but significant. For months she had been taught to see Americans as brutal enemies, inferior people whose society was collapsing under the weight of their own weakness. Yet here she sat, fed more generously than she had been fed in years, offered not just sustenance, but actual pleasure. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could such terrible enemies make something so wonderful? How could people you were supposed to hate show you such unexpected kindness? December brought the first letters from Europe. The International Red Cross had finally established reliable channels for POW correspondence, and thin envelopes began arriving at Camp Boulder with news from the world the German women had left behind. Charlotte stood in Captain Anderson's office with 11 other prisoners, each waiting to hear if their families had survived. The tension was suffocating. Some women clutched their hands together in prayer. Others stood rigid, faces blank, preparing for the worst. Charlotte's letter came from her younger sister Eva, writing from what remained of their family's apartment building in Berlin. The handwriting was shaky, the paper water-stained, and whole sections had been redacted by military censors. But the essential message came through clearly enough. Their mother was dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid in October. Their father had disappeared during the Soviet advance, his fate unknown. Eva was surviving in the rubble, living on rations that barely kept her alive, waiting for some word that Charlotte still existed somewhere in the world. Charlotte read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. She had known, intellectually, that her family might be gone, but knowing and confirming were entirely different experiences. The paper trembled in her hands as the reality settled over her like a physical weight. She was alone. Everything she had been fighting to return to had been destroyed while she sat in this American prison eating apple pie and ice cream. Around her, similar scenes were unfolding. Ilse had received no letter at all, which meant either her family was dead or displaced beyond the Red Cross's ability to locate them. Sophie learned that her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier, information that had simply never reached her until now. Johanna discovered that her entire street in Hamburg had been firebombed, with no survivors reported from her building. Of the 12 women receiving letters that day, only 2 had genuinely good news. The rest learned that the lives they had been clinging to in memory no longer existed. But worse news came the following week, not in letters but in newspapers. Captain Anderson believed in keeping the prisoners informed about the war's progress, and she made American newspapers available in the recreation room. Charlotte had been improving her English by reading these papers daily, struggling through articles about Allied advances and German retreats. But on December 14th, she encountered something that made her previous grief seem almost bearable. The newspapers carried the first detailed reports from liberated concentration camps. Photographs showed skeletal figures behind barbed wire. Articles described systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Names she had never heard before appeared in bold print: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. The reporters wrote about gas chambers disguised as showers, about medical experiments, about mountains of shoes and eyeglasses and human hair, about children, millions of children, murdered simply for being Jewish. Charlotte read until the words blurred together, then read again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the English was clear enough. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. American journalists were describing what their armies had discovered, backed by photographs that couldn't be dismissed as lies. The weeks following the concentration camp revelations were the darkest at Camp Boulder. The German women moved through their routines like ghosts, their faces hollow with a shame that went beyond personal grief. They had served that regime, they had believed in that cause. The knowledge sat in their stomachs like poison, making even the generous American meals difficult to swallow. Charlotte found herself unable to meet the eyes of the guards, convinced they must see her as complicit in horrors she claimed never to have known about. Private Thompson noticed the change immediately. The tentative warmth that had been building since Thanksgiving had evaporated overnight. The German women ate in complete silence now, their faces masks of misery. Some refused dessert entirely, as if pleasure had become something they no longer deserved. Thompson understood guilt when he saw it. His own father had carried it home from the First World War, a weight that never fully lifted. But he also understood that people could drown in guilt if no one threw them a lifeline. On a cold January morning, Thompson made a decision that would have baffled his commanding officers if they had known his reasoning. He approached Captain Anderson with an unusual request. He wanted permission to teach some of the German prisoners how to bake, not just assist in the kitchen, but actually learn the craft. Anderson studied him for a long moment, trying to determine if this was naive kindness or genuine wisdom. Finally, she nodded her approval, curious to see what might happen. Charlotte was among the 5 women selected for the baking detail. She entered the kitchen with reluctance, uncomfortable with the idea of being shown more kindness when she felt unworthy of it. Thompson had flour and sugar and butter laid out on the work table, along with rolling pins and pie tins. He greeted them with his usual easy smile, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the moral crisis consuming them. "Today," he announced, "we're making apple pie from scratch. My grandmother's recipe. She always said that baking is like prayer. You put your intention into it, and it comes out the other end as something good." He demonstrated how to cut cold butter into flour, his hands moving with practiced confidence. "The secret is keeping everything cold until it goes in the oven. Cold hands, cold butter, cold water. That's what makes the crust flaky." Charlotte found herself drawn into the mechanical process despite her resistance. There was something meditative about cutting butter into flour, watching it transform from separate ingredients into a cohesive dough. Thompson corrected her technique gently, showing her how to handle the pastry without overworking it. "Treat it with respect," he said. "Force it, and it gets tough. Guide it gently, and it becomes something beautiful." The metaphor wasn't lost on Charlotte. As she rolled out the dough, feeling it respond to gentle pressure, she felt something loosening in her chest. This small act of creation, this simple domestic task, felt like the first constructive thing she had done in months, perhaps in years. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived at Camp Boulder with the same church bells and celebrations that rang across America. Charlotte stood at the barbed wire fence, watching the American staff embrace and cheer, their joy so pure and uncomplicated that it made her chest ache. For them, this was simple triumph. For her and the other, German women, it was the final confirmation that everything they had believed in had been built on lies and atrocities. Germany had not just lost the war. Germany had deserved to lose. Captain Anderson called a meeting 3 days later to discuss repatriation procedures. The 32 German women gathered in the recreation hall, their faces reflecting months of transformation that none of them had anticipated. They were no longer the defiant soldiers who had arrived in November. They were something else now, something undefined and uncertain. Charlotte noticed how differently they carried themselves, how their military bearing had softened into something more civilian, more vulnerable. "You'll be processed for return to Germany within 6 weeks, Anderson announced, her voice professionally neutral. "Transportation will be arranged through displaced persons camps in Europe. From there, you'll be released to return to your homes." She paused, watching their reactions carefully. Or, what remains of them. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Sophie raised her hand slowly, speaking in the careful English they had all been learning. "Captain Anderson, what if there is no home to return to? What if our families are gone, our cities destroyed, and we have nothing left in Germany?" Anderson had anticipated this question. "The Red Cross will provide assistance in locating family members and finding temporary housing. The Allied occupation authorities are establishing programs for displaced persons." But even as she spoke the official answers, she could see they weren't addressing the deeper question being asked. Charlotte found her voice, surprising herself with her boldness. "Captain, may I speak plainly?" Anderson nodded. Charlotte stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We have learned things here that we did not know before. About our country, about what we were serving, about what kindness from enemies feels like." She gestured toward the kitchen, where Thompson could be seen preparing the evening meal. "In 6 months, we have been treated better here as prisoners than we were treated as citizens in Germany. Better than we deserve to be treated." Ilse stood next, her voice shaking but determined. "We are afraid to go back. Not because of the destruction or the hardship, but because we do not know who we are anymore. We are not the women who came here, but we do not know what Germany will make of who we have become." Anderson looked at the faces before her and saw something she had not expected to encounter in her military career. She saw people caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, and genuinely uncertain about which direction led toward redemption. The request came formally 2 weeks later. Charlotte stood before Captain Anderson's desk with 7 other German women behind her, a carefully written petition in her hands. They had debated for days about how to phrase it, crossing out words and rewriting sentences until the paper was nearly illegible. Finally, Sophie had copied it cleanly in her precise handwriting, and now Charlotte held their collective hope and fear in trembling fingers. "Captain Anderson," Charlotte began, her English now fluent enough to express complex thoughts. "We wish to formally request permission to remain in the United States rather than accept immediate repatriation to Germany." The words hung in the air like an impossible prayer. Anderson's expression remained neutral, but her eyes widened slightly. In all her military service, she had never encountered prisoners of war who wanted to stay with their captors. Charlotte continued, reading from the petition. We understand this is unprecedented. We understand we have no legal right to make this request. But we have nowhere to return to in Germany. Our families are dead or missing. Our homes are destroyed. More importantly, we have discovered here what it means to be treated with human dignity. We have learned what we were truly serving in Germany, and we cannot return to that country without first becoming different people than we were. Ilse stepped forward, adding her voice. Here, we have been shown that enemies can become something else. Private Thompson taught us to bake, not because he had to, but because he believed we deserved to learn something good. Sergeant Mitchell corrected our English not to humiliate us, but to help us communicate. You, Captain Anderson, treated us as people even when you had every reason to see us only as enemies. Sophie spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. We are asking for the chance to earn the right to stay. We will work without pay. We will accept any conditions you impose. We simply cannot go back to Germany and pretend we are still the women who left there. The apple pie and ice cream. It sounds foolish, but that moment changed us. It showed us that the world could contain simple kindness, even in the middle of war. Johanna, the youngest, added the final plea. We do not ask for forgiveness. We know we do not deserve it. But we ask for the opportunity to become people who might someday deserve it. America has shown us what that possibility looks like. Germany only shows us the consequences of our past failures. Anderson sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were asking. She had no authority to grant such a request. The legal complications alone were staggering. But looking at these 8 women who had been transformed by something as simple as kindness and dessert, she knew she had to try. I'll send your petition to Washington, she said quietly. I cannot promise anything, but I will try. 25 years later, Charlotte Werner stood in a bakery in Boulder, Colorado, the sweet smell of cinnamon and apples surrounding her like a warm embrace. The shop was hers, opened in 1952 with a loan from Mrs. Catherine Reynolds, the rancher's wife who had sponsored her immigration after Washington finally approved their unprecedented request. Above the door hung a sign, Werner's Pies, traditional American baking. Customers lined up every morning for her apple pie, never knowing it was made from a recipe taught to her by an Iowa farm boy in a prisoner of war camp. Of the 8 women who had requested to stay, 6 had been granted permission after months of bureaucratic struggle. Charlotte and Ilse had remained in Colorado. Sophie had moved to California, where she worked as a translator for international relief organizations. Johanna had married an American soldier and settled in Michigan. The other 2 had eventually returned to Germany, carrying with them stories of American kindness that helped shape the rebuilding of German-American relations in the post-war years. Private Edward Thompson had returned to Iowa after the war, married his childhood sweetheart, and taken over his family's farm. But he still corresponded with Charlotte at Christmas, his letters filled with news of his children and grandchildren, always ending with the same line. I hope you're still baking pies and remembering that kindness matters more than nationality. Captain Ruth Anderson had retired from military service and written a book about her experiences at Camp Boulder. It had become required reading at military academies, a case study in how treating enemies with dignity could transform them into allies. She visited Charlotte's bakery whenever she passed through Colorado, the 2 women sharing coffee and reminiscing about that strange, transformative time. Charlotte had learned that the other 24 women who had chosen immediate repatriation had found their own paths to healing. Some had become teachers in the new democratic Germany, others had joined peace organizations, and several had worked with Jewish survivors to promote reconciliation. The experience at Camp Boulder had changed all of them, whether they stayed in America or returned home. On this particular morning, Charlotte was teaching her teenage daughter Emma how to make the perfect pie crust. Cold hands, cold butter, cold water. She repeated Thompson's words like a sacred mantra. Treat it with respect, force it, and it becomes tough. Guide it gently, and it becomes beautiful. Emma rolled the dough carefully, her technique already surpassing her mother's at the same age. A customer entered, asking about the apple pie à la mode special advertised in the window. Charlotte smiled, that same surprised delight from 1944 still flickering in her eyes. "It's our signature dish," she said. "The combination of warm pie and cold ice cream represents everything good about America. The way opposites can come together and create something better than either could be alone. It's more than just dessert. It's proof that sweetness can triumph over bitterness, and that enemies can become family if given the chance."